G'day, it's Paul from Derivan, and I'm just going to go through some basic things on creating a little easy painting in watercolour. Now, with watercolour, it's most important that you don't tackle anything that's out of your league, because it is a very difficult product to get your head around until you're used to it. So I thought we'd try with something really simple just to get a feel for what the product actually does. The important thing to remember about watercolours is that the pigments are actually mixed with gum arabic, and what that means is that we can let them dry out on the palette and they're re-wettable. So we can wet these and that will move the paint around again. So for this little project we're just using a little bit of, I'm just going to identify them, some cad yellow here, some pyro red, some purple, and some Australian leaf green. Okay, so just limit yourself to those so we don't get ourselves in too much of a mess. Now, taking a pencil, we're going to draw in our subject. Now we're just going to draw a couple of pears. Now don't panic. If you make a mistake, leave the line. Don't rub it out. The more lines we have, the better. So if I draw in a pear like this, just make sure even that line has a change of weight. So what that means is that there's some dark areas and some light areas. So push softer and harder. So if it's just one line, it's not going to give us as much character as if we redo some of it. So don't worry if there's more than one line. It's actually better. Now, I'm just going to pop another pear down this side here. Over here a bit. Let's just adjust that. Pop a couple of stalks in, just nice and simple. Remember just to have a little bit of a play. Okay, now we're using a watercolour paper here. Now I've just got some Derivan A3 watercolour, so I've just torn this page straight out of the pad. Now I'm just using a Taklon brush today, and what we need to do first is grab some of that green. Now it's the Australian leaf green, remember? And mix it with a tiny bit of the yellow. Now don't worry if those colours haven't mixed on the palette. So see how they're still stranding? That's actually a good thing. So when the paint is stranding, that's actually good, because what it does is create a nicer passage of pigment as it comes on here. If you need to test it somewhere, just test it beside your actual picture. If we need a bit more pigment, just dig into it, grab a bit more and have another go, and there we have it. So I'm quite happy with that. Now what we need to also remember is that watercolours, when you put them on, are slightly darker than as they dry. So when they dry a little bit lighter. So if we pop this on here, let's just race in first by adding a wash to this. And you can see that by changing that mix as we go, just pop on a little bit of it and change it as you go. What that'll do is make sure that it's not a big flat wash. So we need some shape. Let it puddle where there would be. So can you see how, oops, sorry, can we see how as that's uneven, it actually gives that more form. So those pears are starting to get form even as we start these early spaces. So if I just fill this one in. The other thing is with a flat wash like this, try and leave some tiny little holes. So don't fill up all the paper. Leave some little gaps. It's actually a good thing. The important thing here is that if this edge of this pear is dark, make that edge light, and vice versa. If you happen to have dropped this on and this edge ended up light, make the next one dark. That way one will appear in front of the other. So we just need to let that dry off for a little while. So as a rule, if that becomes cool to the touch, so if you just touch it with the back of your finger, it shouldn't feel wet, but it should just feel cool. So what we need to do then is add to this mix that you have on the palette a tiny bit of red. So it's really not to change it from being green, but to darken that green. So what we're actually doing is adding the opposite on the colour wheel. So with a pure colour wheel, the blue and the yellow make green, and so we add red to darken that green. So as we darken that green, we're forming a nice olive type colour. And again, don't do this. We've got to show you what we don't want you to do, otherwise you'll do it. We don't want a big flat puddle of colour, okay? What we want is an interesting mix. So we'll go back into that green. So we've got bits of it that are stranding there, bits of it that have got a bit of red. Can you see how too much red there? We've got it brown. We don't want that either. So be careful with your mix. Play with it here. Make sure, it doesn't matter if you made a mistake like that, we can always get it back. See that? Simple, all right? So don't panic. Now, test that on here before we put it on. And you'll note that this is of the same family because it's essentially, we've got this colour in there, so it is going to work on our pear. Now these, by this stage, have dried off enough for us to have a little play. So what I'm going to do is just add some shadowed areas to these. So I'm going to just pop in a shadow on the bottom of this pear. Okay? And then I'm going to actually drop it on the bottom half of this one. Alright. Just let it join into there. Now, what I'm going to do is just soften that edge now, just with really a wet brush. And we just let that do its own thing. Watercolour is one of those mediums that it'll work its own space. You've just got to let it do its own thing. And as I say, you just need to practice. That's why we start with something quite simple and quite, not easy, but just not too difficult. Now what I want you to do then is grab that purple that we've got and add it to that mix. So all the time we're just, in this instance, just adding to the puddle that we've got on our palette. And again, if we want it a little bit darker, push it a little bit darker. Play with it there until we've got the desired colour. Now look, we're just looking for a brown that's quite dark. You can add a bit more red to it if you want. Don't get too technical with it. We're just looking for a dark that's a nice shadow tone. And what we're going to do, I'm not going to drop the shadows just yet because we just want that edge to dry just a little bit more, but we're going to add some stalks. So we'll drop those stalks on, just plonk them in, and now we're going to add those shadows underneath. So again, just something that's not mixed colour. See how there's going from one colour through to a dark? So I've got sort of from a brown to even a green on the edge there, right the way through to a purple and a dark. Just grab that. So on the brush, so on here, it's not a flat mixed colour. So when we deliver it, that shadow and will actually just make its own colour as it works its way along. Just going to pop a bit more into here. So I've just grabbed a little bit more purple at this stage, just to grab onto the bottom of that. Now, I don't care if that bleeds into the bottom of those pears. It's just going to add to the dimension of that. So it's actually going to give it a rounder bottom on the edge of that pear. Okay, so there you have it. Now, if you need to, just have a couple of goes at that. It's pretty simple and it's pretty easy. But if you try that a couple of times, you'll find that you'll understand how long we need to let it dry, how long we wait before we get a hard line as opposed to this bleeding through the bottom, how long it is before we can actually then go back and add details. So give that a try, but have lots of tries because it is a bit tricky and it does do its own thing. Have fun with it and don't let it send you crazy. Just enjoy the process. Thanks for watching.